Hi there folks, back again for another video. This is a little bit different from the ones I've been doing for the last while because I've actually got my PC back, yay! And it means I can dive into another one of the videos that I've wanted to make for a little while. So I've done a couple of these already where I had a look at a couple of different characters, namely Gamling and Eowyn, and talked about why I thought they were pretty darn awesome and more people should be playing with them in their games and learning a little bit more about them. In this one, we're going to be looking at a couple of characters that essentially come as a pair, as you can see here, and they're not really from the legendarium of Tolkien. These were inventions of Games Workshop when it came to diving into the game and creating new characters and all that kind of thing. So yes, this is Murin and Drar. So yes, Murin is the fellow with the sword and the shield, and then Drar is the chap with the bow at the ready. These were actually, I think, released fairly recently as a kind of like a made-to-order. And when I say fairly recently, in the last 2 years or so, something like that. But they're an absolutely fantastic kit, and they really hone in on what I particularly like about dwarves in Tolkien. You see it a little bit, obviously, with Thorin and company, but then you get a little bit more of it, obviously, with Gimli as well. Is that you've got these kind of, I guess, more with Thorin and co. Yeah, the sort of wandering dwarf thing that you tend to see. It's not something that's essentially built into the dwarven archetype in Tolkien's writing, and a lot of the time they spend many of their days beneath the earth, mining things and caring little for the world of others. But in the case of Murin and Drar, you have a couple of sort of adventurous fellows that have become battle brothers, as it were, heading out into the wider world of Middle-earth and finding themselves getting up to all sorts of different hijinks at the same time. So yeah, you'll see a lot of the images of Murin and Drar come with this focus on the sort of East and Harad and that kind of thing, and that's because they're tied into a particular supplement that came out called Shadows in the East, which was released for Lord of the Rings a little while back. It's not something that you can still get your hands on it. We'll look at it in a second, but it's one that's sort of like faded off into the background, but comes with some really nice sort of scenarios and things in there for people to tag onto. But essentially, Murin and Drar head out into the wilderness, as they are wont to do, and they find themselves on the way back from their adventures down in sort of the areas around Gondor and such, and meet up with a Gondorian or a noble called Cirion, or a general called Cirion, and fight alongside him against the Easterlings that are threatening his particular abode. I got a couple of pictures of the miniatures that I've painted. Sorry for the quality of these, because these had been sitting on the shelf for a little while. So there's my lovely Drar, looking very cool. And then there's my Murin. I did them in the blue that I've done a lot of my dwarves in, and I think it looks quite nice, actually, especially with the gold. I think if I came back to painting these again, I'd probably play around with that Balthazar gold that I love so much on elements of the armor and stuff, but I think it looks really nice. It's kind of like that blue and gold contrast there. I think it's very cool. So yeah, Murin and Drar, they have been around for a little while, and let's dive into the source book that they sort of came from. So if I can just bring this up, here we go, boom. So this is the book that I might have shown off when we dived into some of the things that I'd like to see coming up for Middle-earth, a strategy battle game. But in this one, for, let's find it up, The Shadow in the East, we have a lot of fighting between the Easterlings and the people of Gondor, sort of in the build-up to what happens around Osgiliath and that kind of thing. And in this one, as you can see here, Amon Barad is where a lot of the fighting begins, and it's where Cirion and Murin Drar join forces and fight together as a band of heroes throughout this little campaign that takes place in this sort of northern bit of Gondor. And if nothing else, this is just a really nice thing that kind of shows you a snapshot of the world that maybe you've not looked at before, because obviously a lot of people will focus the fighting around Osgiliath and Minas Tirith itself, but there's a lot to do with Ithilien here, where you can play around with it and have some fun, and obviously it's very close to Minas Morgul as well, so you can dive into that kind of thing, and Caer Andros at the same time. But yes, so you got essentially a stat line for Murin Drar in this book, where Drar had expert shot, which is now just a rule that's sort of built into him in the new one, which we'll look at in a second. But then you also have Kalazal, which is the blade that Murin takes with him, and it's a pretty darn good one for taking on orcs, goblins, and Uruk-hai and the like. So basically anything bad, in most cases anyway. Allows you to reroll some wounds. So yeah, you've got a little bit of a breakdown of them as a pairing. And again, this sort of plays into why I like them so much, is you've got these kind of exceptions to the rules from the Iron Hills that have stepped out into the world, and they're sort of telling their own tale. And I think one of the things that's really nice about them is that it plays into the idea of battle companies and creating your own narratives within the world of Middle-earth. Now, battle companies is always great because it allows you to play around with characters that effectively have no names, and you kind of build up the characters as you play through, and you design campaigns and scenarios based on their exploits and their victories and their failures and everything. And with this, you've kind of got something similar to that with what Games Workshop did, where they basically took a couple of characters and were like, hey, this would be really fun to play around with. Can we bring the dwarves into it a little bit more? Can we play around with them in terms of what's happening with the Easterlings and Rune and all that kind of stuff as well? And then obviously feeding that into a larger campaign, I think, is a great way to kind of show off the combined effort of what's happening in Middle-earth and all the people that have worked together in order to hold back the darkness and things like that. You also have Cirion there as well. So Cirion, or Cirion probably, is a lieutenant of Amon Barad. Now, Cirion is a character that people might know because it's the name of an existing steward from the past when it comes to Minas Tirith and Gondor. This isn't that character. This is one that they've basically just taken the name and turned it into a new character for use in the game, which I think is pretty cool. And he's got a pretty badass model as well. So if you're looking to put together an interesting force on the tabletop, this is a way to go for you, because they've kind of historically carried through this allegiance into the modern version of the Middle-earth strategy battle game. So you got the rules for both of them in this set, and if you can get this PDF or find the book, however you can, this is a really good one to dive into, because you can play through a really fun campaign that starts off with just the humans versus the Easterlings, but then you bring in Murin Drar, and they start to follow through this campaign as they're sort of delving deeper into the mysteries that are happening out there in Ithilien, both the north and the south. And they have a really fun little set of setups that could easily be translated into the modern game nice and quickly. And there's loads of fun things in there, and as you can see, as things go on, they start to include more and more characters. So you have Cirion, Murin Drar, alongside Madril and Faramir as well, which I think is quite nice. So this was the kind of book that they got that kind of added them into the mix, and there's also some really nice stuff in here for where you can then take these and build on stuff and throw in things like the dwarven captains and the warriors from back in the day as well, which is a good addition, I think. One of the things to bear in mind with this, I think, is that you want to kind of play around with the dwarves in an interesting way. And while a lot of people will be very focused on the idea of doing like a force that is very much zoning in on Moria and either the retaking of that or the battles for it, for example, I think there's something quite nice about moving away from that, or maybe the likes of Erebor and the Hobbit era, and playing around with dwarves in a different way when it comes to Middle-earth, and maybe folding them in as allies alongside someone else that you wouldn't necessarily expect, which I think is quite nice, especially because they can sort of be dropped in. So if we go back to I'm going to have to try and bring these up. There we go. So if we go back to I've got the wrong page there. There we go. We want to go back to here, don't we? So when it comes to them in the game, Murin Drar, modern day, you've still got basically a lot of the same things there. So you've got a couple of heroic actions for you to play around with. So you've got heroic accuracy there for Murin Drar, and heroic strike for Murin, and heroic accuracy for Drar. Drar obviously also gets the expert shot. They both come with 3 might, 1 will, and 1 fate each, which is pretty good. Murin also comes with Kalazal, as you can see there. So it's got the same bonus as he had before, although, well, actually no, it's slightly different. I think the original one was rerolling to wound, whereas this one's just +1 to wound against orcs, goblins and Urukai, which is pretty cool to play around with. The other thing that's quite nice about these is that you can't use them as allies essentially with a lot of the stuff that you'd think. So they don't really fit in with the likes of the dwarves that already exist out there. You're more often than not, you're finding them fighting as mercenaries or allies, I guess, alongside different forces. So one of the main ones that you can choose is if you go for a Gondorian force, a Minas Tirith force, as long as you've got Cirion leading the way, they can then join in as sort of good allies with the Minas Tirith force, which I think is a really nice way of doing things. So yeah, I really like the idea of playing around with Murin Drar a little bit more, and as I say, I have the models, and it would be really fun to do something a little bit more with them. I think there's something really nice about the design of the models as well. This was coming, from the designs that we'd seen for a lot of the dwarves already that have been fighting in Moria and stuff, and you kind of get a little bit of that flowing through into the aesthetic that you see here. So you've got something similar in the coats and the mail and in the faces obviously as well. But then when you look at some of the other weapons and things they have, so for example the shield that Murin has, I think is really nice, especially with that kind of bird symbol on it. It's a really nice little touch, the raven. And then I love the helm that he's wearing. And you can also see the other one that's sort of attached to Drar's belt there. I like those because they've got slightly more of an Eastern feel to them, so you almost get the sense that maybe they found them, or they forged them, or they got them made when they were fighting in Gondor or in Ithilien or somewhere maybe further into the east where they were going off on their different adventures. I get the sense of that kind of almost Byzantine feel to them, which I think is a really nice way to take dwarves, playing off that kind of mercenaries fighting in far off countries, a little bit like the Vikings did for the Byzantines and stuff. And I think you see that a little bit in the kind of the design of the jerkins and things that they're wearing and stuff. But yeah, they've got really nice model design and they're really fun to paint. I might go back and revisit these, although I am hesitant to do so because I have already done all the basing and stuff on these at the same time, and I do quite like the way they turned out. I could maybe go back and do a little bit of sort of edging on the side of Drar's chainmail there, but otherwise I'm quite happy with how they turned out. And because I have a Gondorian force waiting in the wings, I mean the Stirith force waiting in the wings, these could slot in quite nicely, I think. I guess the takeaway from this, like in a sort of like a why they're cool kind of thing, is that they sort of break the mold of a lot of other dwarves. You're not playing around with that classic archetype of we delve too deep and all that kind of thing. You're slotting them in as adventurous mercenaries that will wanderers in the wild, as it were, that can be used alongside other troops from different corners of Middle-earth to create an interesting and varied army and maybe tell a little bit of a tale at the same time. I love the idea of maybe visiting their adventures as part of a campaign. I think that could be really fun, where you essentially sort of look at Murin and Drar and you sort of tell their story from one end of Middle-earth to the other, and as you go through they get tagged in alongside different armies. So maybe sometimes they're fighting alongside some elves, and maybe they're fighting against some dwarves, with some dwarves sometimes, play around with the rules a little bit, play fast and loose, and then eventually they make it down to Ithilien, and then you could play through that original Shadows in the East campaign and sort of bring that to the fore with the new rules for Middle-earth strategy battle game. I think that could be really nice. So yeah, dwarves. I love dwarves, and it's always nice to talk about them. I thought it would be different than talking about the regular old Gimli that everybody does talk about. But yeah, I really like them. I think they've got fun profiles. I think it's a really nice sort of test for you when it comes to army building to work out how they're going to fit into the mix, because they don't necessarily fit with what you'd expect them to, which I think is a really good way of doing things. They're not bad either. Fight 5 for Murin, fight 5 for Drar as well, with 4+ on those two. You got strength 4, defense 8 for Murin because he comes with the shield. Drar's still 7. 2 attacks, 2 wounds, and 5 courage. So they're very similar in many regards. And obviously, you've got the bow there on Drar at the same time. So you've got a little bit of covering fire to maybe help out Murin as he gets stuck deeper and deeper into combat. The 3 might is obviously nothing to shrug at either, because it means they're probably going to fight their way through many scenarios, pretty much untouched potentially. And, nobody should laugh at the defense of Dwarves being 7 and 8, because that is a hefty amount of defense for you to try and break through. So yeah, really cool models, as I say, that take things in a different direction from what you're potentially used to from Games Workshop. They told an interesting story when it came to Shadows in the East and sort of where that came in, and sort of how that then blended with Minas Tirith and playing around with the different characters from Gondor and stuff as well, and just a little bit of a fun way for you to take your armies in the future potentially and play around with that. So yeah, not essentially a character made up by Tolkien, but a pair of characters that would be really fun to dive into and play around with in the Middle-earth strategy power game, I think. If you can get your hands on Murin Drar, I recommend you do so, because I think they're really cool, and they could make some interesting armies and scenarios on the tabletop. Let me know if there are any of the kind of made-up characters, potentially, I suppose, from within the Middle-earth universe that you particularly like. I know they're few and far between, but they are very cool. If you like any of them, make sure to drop them down in the comments below. Have you used Murin Drar a lot? Do you like them in your games? Have you found out some interesting ways to play around with them in terms of allegiances and stuff? Would you like to take them and add them into your games? Maybe you've thought about you just using them in battle companies and playing around with them in that, and sort of trying to build them up as characters from sort of like the base level of dwarf warriors or rangers potentially as well. But yeah, make sure to get stuck into the comments down below. It was fun returning to a little bit of Middle-earth. I do have some other ideas for more Middle-earth content in the near future. There's lots of things that I'd love to dive into and chat about, some fun thoughts for the future and stuff. But yeah, it's also, I should say, it's worth having a look online, because there are also some very nice alternative sculpts of Murin Drar from different companies that you might want to pick up, because they it's hard to get hold of these guys anymore. But anyway, I'm going to move on, stop waffling, and stop gushing about dwarves, and I'll be getting ready for another video diving into that soon. But for now, I shall say goodbye, and yeah, what do you reckon to Murin Drar? Let me know in the comments below. Bye.